Welcome to another live stream on Shivai podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Jack Bull. And today we're going to be discussing Ignatius, the historical Ignatius, and also we're going to discuss a little bit about the martyrdom of Ignatius, the tradition about that. But primarily we're going to be focusing on the historical Ignatius and the short recension versus the so-called middle recension of Ignatius. So we're streaming here on History Valley and also on Patristica. And so I just want to say hello to both audiences. And that being said, Jack, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure. I'm excited. Ignatius is a hot topic right now, as I'm sure we'll get into. So it's good to be here.
Yeah, so before we get into the topic, can you give us a brief recap on who Ignatius is for any new people joining in that have no idea who he is?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done loads of videos, both on this channel and on my channel with Marcus Vincent and Mark Bilby called Patristica. And essentially, Ignatius of Antioch is this rather enigmatic figure who writes some letters, which we'll come on to shortly, to various different churches and individuals sometime in the 2nd century on his way to be martyred in Rome. So the traditional story goes that this bishop of Antioch was arrested, presumably for being a Christian, and transported from somewhere in the east, perhaps Syria, all the way to Rome to be killed. And on this journey, he writes these letters encouraging churches to stay strong in the faith and to keep unity, in particular with their bishops, priests, and deacons, as well as warning against certain heresies, particularly probably Docetism. And one letter also to the Romans, which has a slightly different theme, as he encourages people of Rome not to impede his martyrdom. And so one of the great themes we get in Ignatius is the need for him to be martyred in Rome so that he might, quote, attain to God or be worthy of God. And so this figure who writes these epistles is one that is both enigmatic, regardless of which recension you read, in the sense that he has quite different understandings of Christian theology, of ecclesial hierarchy, as well as a different view of martyrdom, I think, in some sense as well, compared to his contemporaries. And his contemporaries are people like Polycarp of Smyrna, who he indeed writes a letter to, which is very interesting. And Polycarp also mentions him in his letter that he writes. And the reception of Ignatius comes to pose at least some of the problem we have with tracking down this mysterious figure. Because what we know of Ignatius is almost exclusively limited to his letters and then to a martyrdom text that was written about him sometime after his death, which is almost certainly, let's say, slightly fantastical in its description of Ignatius's martyrdom. So what we get about Ignatius by later scholars, by later fathers, I should say, is only really in Irenaeus, who quotes Ignatius once, but anonymously. He doesn't mention his name. And then later a little in Origen. And it's only with Eusebius do we get Ignatius, at least in his middle recension, which we'll talk about in a minute, picked up a little bit more. Now, these recensions and collections of letters that I'm talking about are the nub of why I think Ignatius is so interesting. His letters exist in several different forms, and the amount of letters that he supposedly wrote differs depending on the ancient authority you rely upon. So, to make it simple, although this isn't necessarily exhaustive when describing Ignatian nomenclature and his extant letters, we'll just boil it down simply to this, but you can go and research more on other channels if you're more interested. But essentially, he has 3 recensions of letters: a short recension, a middle recension, and a long recension. What does that mean? Well, he has letters to people like Polycarp, Ephesians, and Romans. And these 3 letters exist in a short recension. So a version of the text that is quite small. And then there's another version of these texts with more material in it. And then there's another recension with even more material in it. And alongside these 3 letters, depending on which manuscript you look at, you'll also find different amounts of letters alongside them. So in the short recension, there are only those 3 epistles: Polycarp, Ephesians, Romans. But then there are also more letters alongside them in the middle recension. Now, the middle recension of the Ignatian epistles is the most widely accepted authentic group of Ignatian epistles. And these middle recension epistles are usually assumed to be only 7 in this middle recension. They're usually assumed to be 7 authentic ones in this middle recension. So including Magnesians, Philadelphians, Smyrnaeans, and Trallians. And these are recognized largely as authentic because Eusebius of Caesarea gives us the name of each of the Ignatian epistles in his church history. Then the long recension, which includes the 7 we just talked about in the middle recension, but with even more epistles attached to it, comprises either 12 or 13 letters. And I won't name all of them, but essentially, like I say, these 7 have even more material than they do in the middle, and then are attached to some more. There are 2 other recensions as well of Ignatius' letters to the Romans, but we won't talk about those here today because that will just muddy the picture even more than we need it to be. So these are the different letter collections and the recensions. So we'll either refer to the short, the middle, the long, or the 3, 7, or 13 letter collection. Now, one of the interesting things about this question is, and a lot of people don't know this, is that we have actually manuscripts of the short recension for Polycarp and Romans. So that's helpful in the sense that we can at least trace with a manuscript rather than trying to create hypothetical documents or trying to hypothesize what this so-called short recension would have been. We have a manuscript of that. So too, we have a manuscript of the short recension of the 3 letters. So we have 2 manuscripts that comprise Polycarp, Ephesians, and Romans, all in their short version. So again, we don't have to hypothesize what that might have been. Now, when it comes to the 7-letter collection, this is where the conversation gets a little more interesting, because although the accepted 7 are accepted partly because they were mentioned by Eusebius, but also for other stylistic, grammatical, linguistic reasons, we actually don't have a manuscript of these 7 epistles in the middle recension on their own. So whenever we find the middle recension, they're actually part of the 13 or 12 letter collection. They're not just 7 exclusively. And this is a fact that is almost entirely overlooked by scholarship, because Lightfoot, J.B. Lightfoot, the very famous Bishop of Durham, the English scholar in 1885, essentially just swept all of this under the carpet and supposedly settled the debate for the middle recension of 7 letters, for the 7-letter collection, and then never really spoke of the fact we don't have this manuscript ever again. So we do actually have to, in our minds, imagine such a manuscript. We have nothing really to go off. And then of the long recensions and the 13-letter collection, and even indeed a 15 and 17-letter collection, which again we won't go through right now, we also have quite a few manuscripts of that too. So this is an overview, anyway, of the Ignatian life of Ignatius, the Ignatius letters, and it's the building blocks, I think, from where we're going to start today. But as I mentioned, if you are interested in more in-depth look at the manuscript tradition and the various recensions, letter collections, etc., then go back and watch videos either on Patristica or on History Valley, and you'll be able to see a little bit more about the complex situation we find ourselves in.
All right, so I'm going to play parts of the debate between James White and what's the other guy's name?
Is it Joe Hegsmeyer?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay.
The past 25 years, there has been a tremendous amount of skepticism, scholarly skepticism. Okay, let's make sure we don't. There we go. The light came back on. There has been a tremendous amount of scholarly skepticism expressed as to whether Ignatius even existed and which letters are actually, because there's a Latin and there's a shorter and I was not taught that, but I'm sort of catching up with that. So that I hope Ignatius wrote.
Moss and people like that are taking that view, but it is a fringe view in scholarship.
I hope it's becoming the central view. I hope Ignatius existed and wrote the things we have. But I'm sorry?
You're saying the central view in scholarship is Ignatius didn't exist?
I'm saying that the expression of that, that there are people going, did these letters actually have an original form? There are so many forms of it. Why? That's not relevant to our debate right now. I'm simply saying he may have written in 107 or 108. I hope he did, but maybe not. But what he's addressing, and what's very important, whenever it was written, some people are saying it was 150, something like that. Whatever he was addressing the influx of Gnosticism. And so,
all right, so I'll stop it right there for now. So, Jack, what do you think about what James White said there?
Well, I have more questions than I do answers in some ways to the things that he says there. For those who haven't seen this debate is all about the nature of the Mass as a sacrifice and whether the early church believed this. And for the sake of this debate, I'm actually not really for the sake of this discussion anyway, I'm not really interested in that debate. Let's just park that as to what they thought about Mass or Eucharist or, whatever. What I want to talk about is this phrase here, Ignatius of Antioch didn't exist, and that's the common consensus or becoming the common consensus of scholars. One word answer, it isn't. I know that there is a big trend towards mythicism, particularly for Jesus mythicism, and now apparently Pauline mythicism, and who knows, maybe Ignatius mythicism will be the next big agenda item. Hey, as I pointed out in my comments the other day, why settle there? Let's go for Justin Martyr mythicism, see if Irenaeus can get thrown in the bin. I want to get rid of Tertullian. I'm bored of Tertullian. I've been in him for months. So let's see if we can get rid of as many as possible. But the comment there about whether Ignatius doesn't exist being the scholarly consensus, that isn't actually something a lot easier to talk about, is that demonstrably most scholars do believe Ignatius existed. So that's false. And not only do most scholars believe that Ignatius did exist, most scholars still also believed, in contrary to myself and Marcus Vincent and some others, that Ignatius also wrote the middle recension of those 7 letters. So he couldn't have been further away from the truth there. One of the other things that shows me that the level of knowledge that Dr. White has about the Ignatian question, and indeed from Joe Hegsmeyer to some extent, is the way in which they talk about the recensions and collections rather willy-nilly. So, you hear him say there, well, there's the shorter and the Latin and the longer. Sorry, that maybe I shouldn't do the American accent. But so you see the way they say shorter, longer, and then Latin, as if that in any way describes the state of Ignatian manuscripts. I mean, to just give then a slightly deeper view there, we have the short recension, and we have a middle recension and a long recension. That's what most scholars accept. As I talk about, there's actually really 2 more recensions at least, but we need not go there now. When you're referring to a shorter with ER and longer ER, that's usually a sign that you've only read very old scholarship on this before the short recension was found. So this is where, if you're dealing with Ignatius, your brain wants to explode, because before the short recension was found, they called the middle recension the shorter and the long recension the longer. And then when the short recension is found, the shorter becomes the middle and the short becomes the new short. Nomenclature, ladies and gentlemen, in the state of scholarship, unhelpful, here to confuse you at every juncture. And then when he talks about a Latin recension, well, we actually have the middle recension in Latin and we have the long recension in Latin. So what do you mean by that? We also have the Greek middle and the Greek long. So again, what do you mean by that? So you can see that there's so many things to unpack here in terms of the way we're describing Ignatius. And when he says, I hope Ignatius wrote these things, again, I'm not really sure what he means by that, because I don't think we can have a scholarly attitude that says, I hope X, Y, or Z. Now, again, when I first began my journey into Ignatian scholarship, I actually did wish, maybe not hoped, but I wished that the middle recension might be genuine. But you can't base your scholarship on what I want, wish. I mean, I want the books of Papias. I want Q if it existed, but I mean, want away, unfortunately. And then he says, well, Ignatius is dealing with Gnostics, with Docetists. And I mentioned that at the beginning, and that's because in the middle recension it's long been assumed that Ignatius was dealing with some form of Docetic heresy. He talks about them in his letter to the Smyrnaeans. But in the short recension, which I think are genuine, a lot of this conversation actually goes away. We don't get as much about, well, we get nothing about Docetists particularly, and we also don't get any real clear teaching from Ignatius about who the false teachers are. He warns Polycarp in his letter to be careful of false teachers who was teaching strange doctrines, but he doesn't actually say anything about who these strange teachers are. So depending on which recension you read, your interpretation of what Ignatius says is going to change drastically. And so I just think that one of the problems with apologetics or debates like this is that they seem to have a sort of this sort of in the corner of their eye an understanding of what scholars sort of say, but rather than going through and unpacking it and trying to work out everything, they just don't. And so they end up coming up with these confused nonsense. I mean, it's nonsense, basically. I mean, I don't even know what more to say. It's just not very sensible. And it doesn't also account for both the complexity of the Ignatian question and also the account of scholarship today. But I suppose that the biggest thing is it's demonstrably untrue that most scholars are moving to a mythicist position on Ignatius.
Where do you think James is getting the idea that Ignatius didn't exist from? Scholarship, like what's giving him this impression?
So I suppose I should imagine it's two things. And actually Hegsmeyer brings up one of those things, namely Moss and her 2013 book, I think it was, although she's written subsequent on it, about the myth of persecution in the early church. And Moss is seeking to reevaluate how we understand early Christian martyrdom stories and perhaps say that we over-egg the pudding by believing all of the accounts we have of the martyrdoms of early Christians and that the Romans maybe weren't that bad. I think that plays a large part of it. I think that he has certainly clearly read that early Christian martyrdoms are not as common or as prevalent as we once thought they were, and therefore is trying to bungle in Ignatius being made up along with the martyrdom stories. I think the second thing is, though, and maybe this is actually really the key determining factor, his want for Ignatius to be genuine, I don't really think is true. I actually think it's probably the opposite, that he needs Ignatius not to be true. It's important to remember that in this debate, we are having a Protestant versus Calvinist debate. And there's no doubt that although I think in both cases there is a certain level of applying anachronistic terminology to Ignatius, for example, on transubstantiation, one of the big things they talk about is, does Ignatius believe transubstantiation? Hey, look, it doesn't matter what recension or collection you read, that's anachronistic. The idea that he has a Thomistic understanding of the miracle of accidents and incidents of the bread and wine turning into the body and blood of our Lord Jesus is crazy, right? He just does not have that well-formed theology. So too about Trinity. Lots of people look to Ignatius and say, well, he clearly believes the Trinity. Come on now. You've got to be careful about that. Ignatius is what I've termed his theology is both narrow and shallow. By which I mean he doesn't talk about a lot of theology, and the stuff he does talk about, he doesn't give you any depth, like any. He just says, here's a thing. And so actually I think it's in White's interest to not have Ignatius as genuine, because that's one argument less for the Catholic argument to use against him regarding literal understandings of the Eucharist or the Mass as a sacrifice. So I think they're probably the two key components. But again, it's quite clear that he hasn't read the scholarship on this, or on Ignatius specifically anyway, and that he clearly has come across Moss's work or others who have sought to do this sort of thing and then carried that over to Ignatius. Now, where I would agree with him, and I think this is fair, is that we talk a lot on our channel about the desire of late second century Christians, and even later than that, to add what I call story time or waffle time into earlier texts. So with Ignatius in the short recension, what do we find comes out more and more as the recensions get bigger? Well, three things. One, a gospelizing of the language that's used. So an introduction of words that we sort of find in Paul quite a lot, like resurrection, baptism, that sort of thing. Number two, we find quite a lot more biblical references. So the more recensions of Ignatius we go through, the more references there are to both the Old and the New Testament. But then third, and most importantly, regarding waffle time or story time, is narrative. Lengthy narrative discourse about Ignatius's life, what he got up to, the places he'd been, the things that he'd seen. It moves from being basic letters written to a group of people about one topic or another into, well, I was carried from this sea over to Neapolis, and then I sailed from Troas, and I met these soldiers, and the soldiers were horrible to me, but I was allowed a party to visit me in Ephesus, and they were my great friends, and they refreshed me, and so on and so on and so forth. Every time we get a new recension of Ignatius, the story gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So too, eventually ending up with this text about the martyrdom of Ignatius, which is just wild in terms of its storyline. And so scholars, for the most part, have always been at least slightly skeptical of the story of Ignatius, though not his letters. So even before me looking at the short recension, which lacks a lot of this story, scholars like Roger Parvou, Thomas Lechner, Reinhard Hubner, and Marcus Vincent had already said this Ignatian martyrdom story just doesn't really track, because how is it that we have no other account of a prisoner being carried from Antioch to Rome, which is a great expense, by the way, and we're told in one of his letters that he has 10 soldiers looking after him, which, who's having 10 soldiers look after one man? These 10 soldiers, Ignatius then tells us, are horrible, but yet on his journey, they're allowed to take massive groups of visitors for Ignatius to write lots of letters about Christianity and be brought gifts and things like that. So his narrative has always been suspected to be a little bit out there and probably over-egged, as it were. So I think those things are playing into Dr. White's background and why he thinks it's those three things: sort of the Moss stuff generally, the not wanting Ignatius to be true because it doesn't really help his argument very much, and then third, because scholars have doubted something about Ignatius, he just wants to lump it all in together and say, no. If one bit's gone, it's all gone. And that sort of throwing out the baby with the bathwater attitude is actually, I think, very unhelpful in scholarship.
So I'll play a little bit more. Let me get it back on the screen.
So his emphasis upon the medicine of immortality, they will not partake in the Eucharist. Why? Because they deny that Jesus Christ had a body of flesh and bones. He's arguing against the Docetists. To change that into an argument for transubstantiation is a huge abuse.
All right, that will conclude our cross-examination period. Gentlemen, thank you so much. That was a lively one. I know everybody enjoyed it.
I was sad I didn't get to continue. I wanted to hear a bit of a response there, but they cut the debate short.
Yeah, I'll skip it to about the 2-hour mark where Ignatius is mentioned again. Let me see. Right here.
For Ignatius, you also have the logic of the sacrifice. And I want to make sure this doesn't get omitted. One of the reasons why people today, modern Protestants, modern Calvinists, can think Hebrews disproves what every Christian believed was because now when we think of sacrifice, we think of just killing the animal. That's incomplete. Sacrifice included at least two aspects in cases like this. It's not true of every sacrifice, but in cases like this, you had the killing of the animal, you had the eating of the animal.
All right. Actually, the next couple of instances. Let me see here. The next two instances are more interesting, so I'll play those instead. Okay. Here we go.
God's grace has to be controlled by people who do not want to submit to the fullness of God's truth?
All right, I'd say two things. One, I think the commentary is absolutely right. Like, development of doctrine is not an argument against Catholicism, because Protestants also have to concede that questions get asked in the 4th century that weren't being asked in the 3rd century. Anyone who reads history knows that much. There's work on what the Bible means over time. But second, on the Eucharist, this is actually something the pre-Nicene fathers are very clear on. James claims with no evidence that they believed it was spiritual. Ignatius, who he apparently doesn't believe in, says the Gnostics abstain from the Eucharist and from prayer because they confess not the Eucharist to be the flesh of our Savior Jesus Christ.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Now I'll play the last instance where it's mentioned. At least I think it is the last instance.
Post. He's pointing forward to the Last Supper. So read John 6 in light of the Last Supper. And second, read it in the way the early disciples of John read it. D.A. Carson, in his Gospel of John commentary, points out that Ignatius is a student of the Apostle John and clearly takes a sacramental understanding of John 6.
Thank you. We're going to take another question for Dr. White right here.
All right, so I'll pause it there. Jack, what do you think about those statements by Joe Hexmeyer?
Yeah, well, let's discuss the first one first about Docetists and them abstaining. Okay, that's only in Smoneans. And so in the short recension, which I think is genuine, which I think predates a lot of the Docetic conversation, it's not present. So that's just gone. Right, straight away, we can just sort of put that to one side. I do think that where I agree with him slightly more is this discussion about. Oh, sorry, just one more thing on that about sacrifice, which was the first clip there, actually. Ignatius in the short recension also doesn't really understand the concept of Jewish sacrifice, or not that he doesn't understand, but he doesn't mention it particularly, nor does he even really mention the cross, right? He mentions the cross once, or twice even, but again, it's not that much of a big deal for him in the same way as it will be for later. And the resurrection's entirely absent in the short recension, so that's important. Where I think this is actually really interesting, though, is with this stuff on John. As many of you will know if you're familiar with my work, I actually think that John and all of the Gospels in their final form are not completed until the 2nd century. Indeed, after Marcion publishes his Gospel in around the 140s. And so when we talk about Ignatius knowing John's Gospel and having a Johannine understanding of the Eucharist, I was immediately very skeptical of that as a position. However, I do think that the John 6 Eucharistic discourse is at least somewhat connected to Ignatius of Antioch in the short recension in Romans chapter 7 verse 3, where Ignatius says that he desires the bread which is the flesh of the Lord Jesus, and love incorruptible, which is his blood. I do think that there is an element to which that's Johannine commentary. However, where I would disagree is I don't think it's necessarily the completed canonical John Gospel that we have now that Ignatius is making use of. Rather, he's either A, making use of a Johannine saying that he knows, or B, more likely, that this is a common thing. This is known. This is just an understanding of what the early Christians believed about Eucharist. And where I think that James White is slightly treading on eggshells is that I think it's very hard to not read into Ignatius some form of literal understanding of him eating flesh. Now, again, I'm not jumping to the conclusion that it's transubstantiation. I'm not applying any philosophical metaphysic to the question, nor am I saying that, if you brought Ignatius to today, that he would understand the Mass. I'm really not saying that. But what I am saying is that I do think if we take Ignatius at his word, and all we have is about that, is what he says. I think he does believe that these things are literal, and that the Middle Recension just takes that and brings it one step further, canonicalizes the language, and re-emphasizes the theme, and connects it with the Incarnation. Right, that's the most important thing. I think that the Middle Recension connects Eucharistic theology with the incarnation, i.e., if Jesus doesn't have a body, then this stuff can't be his body, because if Jesus doesn't have a body, how could he have another body that the Eucharist is? So I do think that's true. And Ignatius doesn't have that as much. Ignatius is far less interested in the conversation about whether Jesus had a body in the short recension. And the only reference we get to the incarnation really is in Ignatius Ephesians chapter 19, where we get the star hymn, which is this wild short passage where Ignatius talks about the three mysteries of great renown or great noise or shout, depending on your translation. And he talks about Jesus coming into being. But again, there's doubts even among scholars of the middle recension, never mind me in the short recension, about whether this was a genuinely Ignatian hymn, and that whether this might predate Ignatius in a different context. Dijkgraber was the first to really pick this up, and I agree with him. I think this is not Ignatian either, which means that if we reject that too, then Ignatius' understanding of the incarnation is zero, or at least what he tells us about the incarnation is zero is probably more accurate to say, and therefore James White is further undermined in the sense that Ignatius is not talking about Docetists at all. It's an entirely irrelevant question.
When would you say that the historical Ignatius wrote in the 2nd century? Would you date him to when the first 10 years of the 2nd century, which is where the church fathers seem to be putting him in, or is he writing later in the 2nd century?
Yeah, good question. I think he has to be writing in the very early part of the 1st century, because Polycarp picks him up. And because Polycarp picks it up and knows he's dead, well, depends what you think about chapter 13 of Polycarp's letter. If you reject Polycarp's chapter 13, then Ignatius is already dead. And if that's happened, well, then we know roughly when Polycarp was. So we must say that Ignatius is before that. I immediately always see the comment of something like, well, but you've got no proof that Ignatius existed except that he's mentioned by a couple of others or whatever. And people always, pitch for, well, nobody existed, which I spoke about at the beginning of the podcast. And my question always is about that front. It's like, well, what evidence are you looking for? I mean, I don't quite understand what you would want him to have done, whether you want him to, build a great pyramid like the great kings of Egypt to leave his memory. I mean, ultimately, he's a nobody. He's not even well respected in his own community, actually. I mean, it's not abundantly clear that people even like him. So the idea that even they're going to pay homage to him is unlikely. So what do you want me to give you? I mean, he's not very well liked. The only church father that picks him up early doors is Polycarp. Hey, look, that's the earliest you could possibly expect him to be picked up, really. And then in terms of his death, I mean, the guy's eaten by lions, apparently. Whether that's true or not, let's say he dies just in obscurity. I'm not going to have his body. I can't, although they claim to have it in the Basilica of St. Clement in Rome, which I went to last year. Apparently it's actually a dog's bone in there, but let's not talk about that right now. So yeah, and in addition to that, I think one of the other reasons that I do believe in Ignatius is because of Lucian of Samosata, who writes this satirical work called The Death of Peregrinus, where he talks about Ignatius, talks about a figure called Peregrinus, who is remarkably similar to Ignatius. I mean, the similarities between them are so striking that they are clearly talking about the same person, these letters and this satirist, Lucian. For a bit of context, I mean, this Lucian character is sort of the modern day Jimmy Fallon, or in the UK, Ian Hislop. He's someone who takes political figures of whatever stripe, it doesn't matter whether they're Republicans, Democrats, Labour, Conservative, whatever it might be, and rinse them, they make them look silly. They try and mock them and deride them and create comedy out of it. Lucian does it to the Stoics. He does it to Epicureans. He does it to Ignatius. And I think that the reason why he has this character in his head is because he knew the story of Ignatius and ripped it off and made a great sort of mocking text of this bishop. So there's some of the reasons I think he existed. And again, I think we have to date him to the earlier parts of the 2nd century because people pick up on him so quickly. The caveat to all of that, I suppose, is Irenaeus, because he only quotes Ignatius anonymously. He says, as a certain martyr said, and then proceeds to quote from Ignatius Romans 7. And that is a slight peculiarity that we should know, particularly as if Irenaeus did know Polycarp and Polycarp knew Ignatius, then we could assume, I think fairly safely, that Irenaeus would have known him. Origin
So why is he
also,
being vague is the question.
yeah, and you know, my answer to that is rather unsatisfactory. I'll admit that my answer to that I'm not entirely pleased with. I think the answer is because Irenaeus thinks that people are going to know who he is. Now, that is a completely useless answer, but that's the only one I've got, which is why I'm giving it. But again, before any comment, yeah, I mean, but before any comment comes through into the YouTube chat, just know that I'm not happy about with that either, because either side of it. So after we get Justin, Polycarp, who mentioned him, and then Origin later on, right? Origin in the beginning of the 3rd century knows Ignatius, again in the short recension. So it's clear that people know who he is. So yeah, Ignatius probably beginning of the 2nd century, I would say. Just to say, actually, maybe one more thing on that. I think one of the other reasons that people don't pick up on Ignatius in the same way they do some others is because he actually isn't very useful. I don't want to give him a slight, but in the short recension, Ignatius is actually quite useless in the sense that, as I mentioned earlier, he's not giving great justification for any of these complex later theologies or difficult Trinitarian, Eucharistic concepts that are being debated. He does nothing. I mean, he talks mostly fluff. The epistle to Polycarp is rushed, strange, slightly patronizing. The epistle to Ephesians is rambling, and the epistle to Romans is only really about, please don't interfere with my martyrdom. I want to die for God. Yeah, okay, fine. But I can't use him as a justification for much of my later proto-Orthodox beliefs, right? So I think that's why he also becomes rather strange. Alan Brent also pointed out in his 2006 book, Ignatius of Antioch and the Second Sophistic, that Polycarp also has completely misunderstood Ignatius, at least in the middle recension. So Alan Brent believes in the middle recension. And he says that one of the reasons that Polycarp doesn't mention Ignatius more is because he completely doesn't get it. You know, he sees this complex ecclesial hierarchy, which Brent says is replicating the imperial cult of the emperor. And there's lots of really complex sort of rituals going on here that emulate Second Sophistic thinking. And Polycarp and Justin and Irenaeus go, no, that's weird. You're very strange and we don't like it. And they just put him to one side. And so that might be another reason why he's not picked up.
When was the long recension created, and do we know who might have been responsible for creating that longer recension?
Yeah, fantastic book, actually. Let me just double check the date here, just in case people want to find it. By Paul Gilliam, 2017. He wrote a book called Ignatius of Antioch in the Arian Controversy. And most people argue that the long recension was written in the context of the Arian controversy, because that's when we start to see an explosion of these quite clearly anachronistic theologies and philosophies concerning Trinity, liturgy, the natures of Jesus, etc. And I would be tempted to agree with him, except for one caveat. I think that I've shown, because of the complexity of the recensions and letter collections, that what we're left in extant manuscripts is actually none of what we have is the original Ignatius. All of it shows signs of cross-contamination and corruption. And so, for example, I think on some occasions it's actually the long recension that shows the oldest reading of the text. And when you say that, people are like, what? That's meant to be a 4th, 5th century invention. Oh, yeah. But I think that doesn't mean that the earlier forms of that recension weren't part of another family that wasn't corrupted in different ways. So as an example of this, in every Ignatian epistle, in the major letter collections, Ignatius is described as Theophorus, meaning God-bearer, the one who bears God or carries God. Every recension, every letter. Ignatius, the one who is Theophorus to whoever it might be. Now, there are two exceptions to this. One is in some Syriac recensions, not the short recension, I might add. It just includes Ignatius, the one who is clothed with God. No Theophorus. Aha. So that's another recension that we're already not talking about. The other exception to that is actually in the Latin long recension. In the Latin long recension, we get 13 letters. Every one of them begins Ignatius, who is Theophorus, except one. Ignatius' letter to Polycarp, that is Ignatius, who is bishop. Now, this is so... When I first saw this, my eyes almost bulged out my head, and I let out a slightly girlish whimper because of my excitement. Because it showed me something really interesting about this letter, is that whoever the scribe was here, he must have had Ignatius the bishop in that manuscript when he transcribed it. Because he cannot have got it wrong or changed it. If in 12 other letters he has Ignatius Theophorus, and then only in one he has the bishop. And so I've argued that because the introductions to Ignatius differ, either Theophorus clothed with God or bishop, I tried to think, well, which one makes the most sense? Which one would someone self-determine? What would there supposed to be self-determination about themselves? And what do we have in early Christian sources about him? And the name Theophorus is never applied to Ignatius until much, much later. So that immediately then makes me think, no, that's a later invention. And also, if one thinks about themselves, to determine yourself as God carrier, I think is also a little bit brave. You then say, what about clothed in God? Yeah, perhaps, slightly more humble. And indeed, he's going to use that phrase in his letter to Polycarp. And he's going to say, you are clothed in God. So we know he's got that in his repertoire. But then just Bishop of Antioch. I mean, that's quite descriptive. I quite like that. I think that you could see a world where someone would call themselves that. So you see there that the long recension, although again I could be convinced otherwise, could actually hold the oldest reading there despite being a 4th century work. So too, we find even in the short recension things that are almost certainly not right. Ignatius' letter to Polycarp, chapter 6, has so many issues. Chapter 19 of Ephesians, which we mentioned earlier, has so many issues. So there are clearly corruptions, mistakes, issues, scribal errors going on. And that's even before we mention the other two recensions in the Arabic tradition and in the Martyrdom tradition of Ignatius. And in the Arabic tradition of Ignatius, which we have the letter to the Romans, that letter in its beginning is radically different from what we find in any recension, and again seems to present the oldest version of the text. The mystery of the Ignatian epistles is so much further away from being solved than I thought it would be when I started. I think all scholars go into their questions respectively saying, I hope to shed more light on this. I hope I bring some answers. I got to the end of 110,000 words of research and thought, I think I know far less than I did at the beginning, and that the Ignatian questions only got messier than it was when I started. And the only way really around this, I think, is for scholars to stop relying on the nomenclature that we have and begin to accept its messiness, and then get a critical edition, and then try and move on from there. But at the moment, definitive comments on Ignatius, I'd be very wary of that.
Does the short recension of Ignatius make any hint at all to gospel material?
Yes. So it depends to what extent you want to think constitutes a biblical reference. So scholars have categorized things into sort of 3 groups. Quotations, allusions, echoes. They're sort of the 3 generally accepted ways in which you can quote a text. Quotations are fairly straightforward. It's when you verbatim, word for word, chuck something in, right? So it's like the Matthean prophecies from the Old Testament about Isaiah. You know, he just quotes them directly. Then there's things like allusions, where there's sort of a very clear reference made to a text, but without a verbatim quote. And then lastly, echoes, which is when a text seems to know another text, but without either directly referencing the person or quoting verbatim. Now, in the Middle Recension, scholars have always concluded with a great degree of certainty, and I would agree with them about this in the Middle Recension, that Ignatius knew Matthew, John, and 1 Corinthians. Maybe a couple of others, but at the very least them. In the Short Recension, we're left with some of these things. We're left with a couple of Matthean-esque quotes, a couple of Johannine things. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have said quotes. Matthean allusions or echoes. So to Johannine allusions. However, I think it's really, really tough to say there is a literary dependence. And that's why Ignatius is so important. Not only is he the biggest extant corpus of material outside of the New Testament, in the beginning of the second century, he also is one of the key figures for dating the Gospels because he quotes them so frequently. But like I say, in the Short Recension, most of those are gone. And I think it's very easy to account for them, as actually Custer suggests even in the Middle Recension, that these are just general floating logia or themes or thoughts. And I think there's no easy way of getting around the fact that in the Short Recension, Ignatius does not mention the Gospels, or at least does not know them. Even though he makes some sort of teeters on the idea of some of the things that they have, like in Ignatius Romans 7, where he talks about the Eucharist being the blood of Jesus and love incorruptible and all this sort of thing. Could be saying, oh, that's John 6, isn't it? It's a big jump because Ignatius then makes no reference to any other miracles of Jesus in the Short Recension, or even outrageously the resurrection. This links me on then to Paul. What does Ignatius know about Paul? Nothing. Almost certainly nothing. He does mention Paul and Peter by name, but then doesn't seem to know any of their texts, even of their theologies, these echoes or allusions. So I think that's a big issue. And just to draw back into then the wider question, it's that if someone at the end of the 2nd century, as most scholars believe, have taken the Middle Recension, and at the end of the 2nd century then say, oh, do you know what? I like this Middle Recension, but there's just a few things I don't like. I tell you what I'll remove. I'll remove the resurrection, things about Jesus, quotes from the Gospels, things about Eucharistic theology, Docetism. Yeah, that seems like a good idea. I think that's preposterous. I think that's a crazy thought that someone would do that. Even the name of Jesus, actually, they remove sometimes. So yeah, I think that we're left with basically the idea that in the Short Recension, Ignatius does not know one singular book of the New Testament, nor for that matter, of the Old Testament. He is a scriptureless man in many ways.
And not even the church fathers are claiming that that's an abbreviation at all. That's just a modern claim.
Yeah. But he's not picked up at all. I mean, that's one of the issues with like trying to track it. Now, we get one small piece of very interesting information. And at my Viva, Professor Mark Edwards disagreed with me on this. And so, again, do not take me as the unilateral sole authority on Ignatius, because I'm really, 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 really not. And Professor Mark Edwards is a far more esteemed, distinguished, excellent scholar than I am. But the only reference we get to the Middle Recension in early doors is from Origen. And he quotes a passage from Ignatius' letters to the Smyrnaeans. And you think, excellent. We have Middle Recension. But then he attributes it to the doctrine of Peter, or the teachings of Peter, and not to Ignatius. And the first person to attribute that passage to Ignatius is Eusebius. 100 years so later. And that's so strange. And again, Eusebius doesn't pick up on any idea, like you say, of corruption or addition, interpolation, anything. See, now, with our other favourite topic on Marcion, we get loads of hullabaloo about Marcion corrupting Luke, corrupting Paul as the deceiver, as a big fat liar. He butchers and performs surgery on Paul to make it fit his own agendas. And we get great commentary on all of this. But on the Ignatian epistles, nobody bats an eyelid, even up to Eusebius. Indeed, ever. Right? It's only really with the discoveries of these things, and the conversation really starts to come alive in the 16th century, really. That's when this conversation is properly discussed, because with the Reformation, Protestants are very wary of Ignatius because he mentions things like bishops, priests, deacons, and Eucharistic theology. And so naturally, people like John Calvin, he, quote, says, "There's nothing more fantastical than to believe Ignatius of Antioch wrote these epistles." And therein lies some of the first commentary on this process. So yeah, it's a completely modern thing, and it strikes me as amazing that particularly Eusebius and Origen don't pick up on it, because they are such sort of key figures in this. I should add as well that Clement of Alexandria, also sort of maybe Theophilus and maybe Athenagoras, maybe even Melito mentioned Ignatius, or at least quote from his text a little bit. But again, no commentary, no context, nothing. Just here's a quote, and that is radical, right? I mean, that's so strange to me that it doesn't get picked up on.
What do you make about Origen making that reference, the so-called middle recension reference, and attributes it to Peter, and then Eusebius flips it to Ignatius?
So this is where maybe I should have explained that, shouldn't I? This is where Professor Edwards and I disagree. So Professor Edwards thinks that Origen is quoting from the teaching of Peter here, and that it was originally there, and that Ignatius then uses it, and that Eusebius then just says, "Well, yeah, but Ignatius does say it, but Eusebius also knows it's in the teaching of Peter." So that's Mark's Mark Edwards' understanding, and I can see, I'm not saying it's impossible, but Origen is exceptional. Again, I know he makes mistakes, but without Origen, we would know precious little about this early church lark, and he doesn't tend to make that big a mistake. And combined with the fact that Origen only actually knows the short recension when he quotes from Ignatius on any other occasion, that to me again is probably more than coincidental. That when he quotes from Ignatius, it's only the short recension, and then when he quotes something that isn't from the short recension, he attributes it somewhere else. That to me seems like too much of a coincidence, and that's why I think that the middle recension is built around other texts. Just to give you another example of how that looks, in Ignatius's letter to the Romans, in chapter 7 and 8 of the short recension, we get this interesting couple of paragraphs, not very long. But in the middle recension, these two paragraphs are moved into the middle recension. And it strikes me that the redactor, or the editor, the interpolator, whatever you want to term this fellow, has used this as the basis for another letter, right? He's ripped it out and used it as the basis of something else. So too, I think with the Doctrine of Petri and with this short recension business, it's not present in the short recension, but then someone uses the Doctrine of Petri and then adds that in as, again, to help his new letter to the Smyrnaeans. Again, to reiterate, I'm not saying that I'm definitely right or that Mark is definitely wrong, but that I just think it seems like too much of a coincidence and too much of an too much to account for, to decide that.
I'm gonna play a video from Capturing Christianity. Let me see. Hold on a second. It won't open, so give me a second. So I'll just ask you something right now while we're waiting on that. What led to the belief that there even was a middle recension?
Sorry, can you repeat that again? Sorry.
What led to the belief that there was even a middle recension?
Yeah. So ultimately, Eusebius of Caesarea is our main culprit here. Because he enumerates 7 letters, the ones in now accepted as 7 letter collection, they become known as genuine, and that's one of the reasons that Lightfoot is so desperate to vindicate them. However, even scholars like Theodore Zahn in 1873 said that there's a problem even with that middle recension, and actually Zahn ended up denying Romans because it had a lively different transmission history. So that's basically what Lightfoot does. He says, well, Eusebius knows 7, therefore I'm going to vindicate these 7 and the middle recension, and pays no attention in the meanwhile really to the manuscript evidence. He does give a description of all of the manuscripts, I think in part 2 of his 1885 set, 3-volume set on Ignatius, but then doesn't seek to comment on them, either their antiquity, nor their provenance, nor their reception. He just goes all in and says, well, these 7 are true because basically I say they are. He provides 17 pages, 17 tiny pages concerning the internal linguistic evidence for why Ignatius in both recensions shows sort of similarities. And he says, well, look, the way that Ignatius uses this particular preposition or this particular verb, you can't replicate that. That's impossible. And that's his argument for basically saying the middle recension is genuine and the short recension is not. It's funny, though, because in 1963, Milton Perry Brown published the first ever statistical analysis of Ignatius's style, grammatical style, lexical style, etc. And in that book, he only compared the long recension and the middle recension, playing them off one another and saying, well, look, this is why the long recension is so different from the middle. Look at all these other literary techniques that the long recension has and the middle recension doesn't. Therefore, the middle recension must be older. And it's funny because I only took Milton Perry Brown's methodology and applied it to the short recension to show that the same issue as applies from the middle to the long is the one we can apply to the short to the middle. Because when we're looking at these texts, where Lightfoot went wrong is that he was looking for similarities between the two texts rather than discrepancies. And often the discrepancies are far, far more significant than the similarities. And so Lightfoot's decision of the 7 letters basically arises largely, like I say, from Eusebius, but then is compounded by this sort of idea that he has about the lexic and the grammar, etc.
All right. We'll play a little bit of this video and respond to it before we close. Let me just drag and drop it real quick. There we go. At last.
Imagine you're watching a debate between 2 Christians, all right? You've got a Protestant on one side, you've got a Catholic on the other, when suddenly one of them casually suggests that a major figure in Christian history just might not have existed at all. And no, I'm not talking about this is not like a random Bible skeptic on TikTok. I'm talking about Dr. James White, the
seminary, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, over the past 25 years, there has been a tremendous amount of skepticism as to whether Ignatius even existed and which letters are actually, because there's a Latin and there's a shorter and I was not taught that, but I'm sort of
Okay.
catching up with that. So
And when Joe called him out by saying that's a fringe view, White literally doubled down and added this.
I hope
Yeah,
Ignatius
Candida
wrote.
Moss and people like that are
I
taking that
hope,
view, but it is a fringe view in scholarship.
I hope it's becoming the central view. It's becoming the central view. It's becoming the central view.
It's becoming the central view.
It's becoming the central view. And he's talking about Ignatius of Antioch. This is not a random dude. Okay, this is Ignatius. This is the early church father, disciple of John, the apostle, author of 7 letters, martyred in Rome around AD 107. That's like saying, hey guys, maybe St. Paul never existed. No serious scholar is saying this, but James White just did on camera in a debate. We don't know why. Now, to be fair, maybe you're wondering, okay, Cameron, but how settled is the existence of Ignatius really? Okay, according to the scholarship. Great question. Let me give you the scholarly consensus now, but I know that scholarly quotes can kind of put you to sleep, so let me quickly sum it up in human terms, all right? Charles Gore, a major Anglican scholar back in 1900, basically said, quote, "We've settled this controversy already. Ignatius is legit. It's time to move on." Okay, that was not a direct quote, but it's pretty close, all right? B.H. Streeter, writing decades later, said, yeah, this was settled long ago by a guy named J.B. Lightfoot. Ignatius existed, case closed. Again, not a direct quote, but pretty close. Even Stephen Neal and the famous N.T. Wright, okay, you guys have probably heard of N.T. Wright, said in 1988, he's not that old, every elementary textbook assumes Ignatius' authenticity. Again, not a direct quote, but very close. And more recently, Michael W. Holmes said the authenticity debate was settled once and for all. Now, if you really want the receipts to these quotes, I've linked all the sources in the description of this video, but
All right, I'll stop it there.
I don't know if any of you saw my little scream. I was on mute, but I let out a little scream, I'm afraid. Sorry, I thought you were going to ask a question.
No, how do you respond to what Capturing Christianity was saying there?
Let me preface this by saying I have nothing but respect for Cameron and nothing. I actually don't give people the hard time. I think sometimes we give apologists and other of these channels a hard time, and I have no doubt that that's what he's read. And the reason why I have ultimate sympathy for him is because most scholars believe that utter rubbish. It's not his fault because most scholars believe it. I go to conferences, I meet academics, I meet people who are learned researchers, and they will quote the same thing to me. J.B. Lightfoot settled this debate in 1885. And indeed, actually, there is a consensus even among Protestants, Catholics, and secular scholars on this. I am, again, fringe. I accept that. But you know, when I realized that I'd made some progress here on Ignatius, was when the aforementioned Alan Brent. Alan, I can't get across to you guys how big Alan is. I mean, he's such a good guy and he's such a good scholar. And he was one of the world's leading, he's not dead. He's still one of the world's leading experts on Ignatius. And he's a good friend of mine. He turned around to me one day and said, I think there's an issue with Ignatius. And you know, if Alan says that, then you have got an argument. He doesn't agree with me wholeheartedly. He has other ideas about where the short recension came from, which I've talked about on my channel. But he says the debate is open, wide open, and that the conversation is far from being settled, but is the most complex it's ever been. And so when Cameron says that, Capture Christianity says that, it's not that he's wrong per se to say that scholars say that, N.T. Wright, Gore, whatever it might be, but they're wrong. That's the problem. They've got the situation wrong. And indeed, as even actually to give you an insight, I mean, before this, Jacob and I were discussing how many hours, Jacob, we discussed Ignatius. I mean, more hours than I like to think about now, probably.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, well, we don't even have the middle recension is a manuscript. And you went, oh, you should definitely bring that up. That's important. And the thing is, you know, you do a lot of research, you do a lot of reading, you do a lot of work. But I think it's fair to say you're probably not an Ignatius of Antioch scholar. That's probably fair. But I meet Ignatius of Antioch scholars who don't know that. I meet Ignatius of Antioch scholars all the time who specialize their whole lives in Ignatius of Antioch, and they don't know that. It's not anyone else's fault then that they don't know it, because they're not telling anyone, or because they don't know. So Cameron couldn't be further away from the truth there. But again, don't give him a grief about it. It's just unfortunate that people like N.T. Wright and others have only relied on the work of Lightfoot in 1885. And I just add maybe this to finish. I think Ignatius of Antioch is probably the most neglected figure in early Christianity. There's reams and reams of material on Clement, Polycarp, Shepherd of Hermas, Goodacre, and yet on Ignatius we've only got one proper commentary. The largest group of extant material in the early Christian church, and we have one commentary, really, one proper one, 1985 by William Shadell. And this is indicative of the fact that Ignatius has been neglected and that the research of Lightfoot has not been tested and put and questioned and just believed verbatim. My great sadness, I think, is that Ignatius wasn't included in the Christian New Testament canon, because at least if it was, it would have got the rigorous testing and debate that it deserved, like Paul gets, or 2 Peter. But I think for some reason Ignatius just gets left alone, and it's largely because Lightfoot did such a good PR job. I think it was PR of demonstrating why he was right and everyone else was wrong, and no one ever debated it again. I would just say, a couple of scholars like Robert Jolie, I see in the chat, and Marcus Finnen and Hubner have discussed it, but never to the extent where they've actually looked at the manuscripts and recensions properly. So we should go and do that. And if you hear anyone say anything definitive, like Cameron just did about Ignatius, hold up, wait a minute, go back and read the literature and try and reassess.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Jack Bull.
Thank you, real pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.